Golden Cosmos, the only story by Julian Barnes, 254 pp. Alfred A. Knopf, $25.95. If English life, as Lawrence Durrell was fond of saying, is by and large a long, slow toothache, then Julian Barnes is now perhaps its principal dentist. Over a period of more than 30 years, he has returned again and again to certain lugubrious and exacting English themes, suburban conventions, coming-of-age anxieties and the enigmas of bourgeois love. From his first novel, Metroland, to The Sense of an Ending, which won the Booker Prize in 2011, Barnes has applied a melancholy drill to a patient still confined to the chair. Could argue that in The Only Story, Barnes's new book, he is taking his cue from Flaubert, as he did in his best-known work, Flaubert's Parrot. The older woman in this novel, 48-year-old Susan MacLeod, stands in for Madame Arnaud of A Sentimental Education, and 19-year-old Paul Casey could be seen as a version of Frédéric Moreau. They are, after all, eternal archetypes. The revolutions of 1848 in Flaubert's novel become in Barnes's work the multiple revolutions of the 1960s, not least the sexual revolution. A passing reference to a private eye cartoon of Prime Minister Alec Douglas Home situates the crucial action of the novel in the years 1963-64, a fateful era in Britain's own cultural upheavals. Flaubert stated that he wanted to write the moral history of his generation, to excavate passions that he declared were, despite the romantic pretenses of French society, inactive. Barnes has set out to do much the same. The Only Story is just as pessimistic, with about the same satirical temperature and measuring the same ironic distance from what at first seems to be a love story that might generate some erotic heat. But in the mood for love, this is not. In a small town in suburban Surrey, Paul meets Susan at the local tennis club, where they are assigned to be partners in a doubles tournament. Susan is married, with 2 daughters, and as Mrs. Robinson's go she is shy but ironic, seemingly insouciant but grimly trapped in a sterile marriage to Gordon MacLeod, a nondescript British Empire type who is given all the most charmless attributes of both his generation and his race. The generation being that of World War II, described here as played out and traumatized, exhausted and sad, with no hint of the greatest generation mythology that has benefited its American counterpart. If one thinks back to the semi-forgotten satire of the British 60s, shows like That Was the Week That Was, and the Beyond the Fringe skits helmed by Peter Cook, Dudley Moore, Jonathan Miller and Alan Bennett, the first thing that is striking is the delicious comic tension between the wartime generation and the generation that followed. The comedy is driven by the one-time solidity of archaic British types, Colonel Blimps in academics with plummy accents, cap-tipping proles and Middle Englanders with lips so stiff they can hardly talk. But that seemingly solid tapestry of social orders melted away into nothingness almost overnight. Barnes sets his tale in its twilight, among what he calls furrowed dwellers, the torpid English middle classes, but he refrains from deriving much comedy from it. His Gordon MacLeod is a drunken brute who slams his wife's face into the door jamb. Narrating the first section of the novel, Paul is filled with rage for this hateful caricature of a man, though this is entirely unsurprising since nothing complex or sympathetic is offered on behalf of the luckless and cuckolded Gordon. It might have occurred to Paul at some point that a 19-year-old doing the deed with your wife under your own roof might inspire a little chagrin, but Paul is himself, and purposefully, I think, a self-righteous adolescent who never quite sees it this way, for all his grandstanding about his own shame. When asking himself, in retrospect, how much he understood about love at 19, he intones, a court of lay might find, no, sympathy and vitality are reserved for the women in Paul's telling, and indeed the authors. There are shades here of Sarah, Graham Greene's heroine, and at the end of the affair, Susan is, without question, the character linchpin of the novel, and she is rendered touchingly. Miraculously, she shines through her lover's philosophizing about love and memory, about which he has little original to say. She has spirit. The young man and older woman begin a hesitant and fumbling sexual liaison whose sacrilegious tenderness is, however, never quite incarnated by Paul's recollection of it. Take her years, at which he marvels. In an early moment of their lovemaking, he remembers, it wasn't until we were in bed and I was rummaging and rootling around her body, into every nook and cranny, every over-examined and under-examined part of her, that, crouched above, I swept back her hair and discovered her ears. One wonders at his language here. Rummaged and rootled? Was she really enjoying such a feverish examination? This makes him sound like a stamp collector going over his latest finds rather than an awestruck adolescent losing his virginity. But this is Barnes's point, I assume. Strange as it may seem, Paul implausibly reflects just before the episode of the years, I never reflected on our age difference. teenage boys do lose their cherries to much older women, and they do so in the garden suburbs south of London, but it's rare that they never reflect on doing so with a woman nearing 50 with a husband and 2 daughters in tow. Nor do they tend to set up house with them. Still, one could argue, after all, that this is the Emmanuel Macron story, with the cruel difference that Paul goes on to become not the leader of a major European nation but an obscure loser after eloping with his mistress and utterly failing to live happily ever after. For the darkness of the story only invades you in its last 100 pages. Years later, Paul settles down alone in the countryside to run something called the Frogworth Valley Artisanal Cheese Company and acquires a taste for reading lachrymose agony columns in the local newspaper. He also bakes. He not only loathes the memory of Susan's husband but most men to boot, finding them boastful, oafish and predatory, both beastly and comical. As for himself, he is by his own account an absolutist for love. In other words, he is somehow less human than the man he still hates. As the only story proceeds, Barnes slips in and out of the first, second and third person voices. Sometimes, but not always, with subtle effect. Near the beginning of the second section, which explores Paul and Susan's uneasy cohabitation, the slip into the second person heralds a nice gear shift into Paul's self-questioning. Barnes has a skillful command of tone and its moral implications, when he chooses to exert it. In the more hardened third person at the end of the book, the narrator has Paul recall a public service ad about AIDS in which it is suggested that when two people have sex they have sex with all their previous partners, and at once the ruminations become interesting. In that voice, the novel seems to find the right distance from its subject. I like the way Paul gradually forgets the very body he had overly fetishized, even the ears. Things, once gone, we are told, can't be put back. He knew that now. A punch, once delivered, can't be withdrawn. Words, once spoken, can't be unsaid. We may go on as if nothing has been lost, nothing done, nothing said. We claim to forget it all, but our innermost core doesn't forget because we have been changed forever. Of which we can say that this is both true and beautifully put. As Paul opines, in love, everything is both true and false. It's the one subject on which it's impossible to say anything absurd. Which isn't true, but I like it anyway. There is much food for self-contemplation on the part of the generation that came to maturity in the 1960s, and it's a popular theme among British novelists born in the 1940s. But it has proved difficult to pull off. Love isn't the only story, as it turns out, even if, as Paul insists, first love fixes a life forever. Barnes is aware of this, but to relate in some way the dark sides of the Cultural Revolution of the 60s and that of his coming-of-age story, he would have had to let his characters emerge a little more from Paul's perspective and the look at me in the dark exegesis of his poor treatment of a woman he never really understands. Here and there, all the same, Barnes's rapier wit flashes and glitters. At one point in his decline, Paul gets punitively drunk to the point of sudden rationality. What a delicious phrase that is, and how much more Paul might have delivered on it. Lawrence Osborne's latest novel is Beautiful Animals. A version of this review appears in print on April 29, 2018, on page BR13 of the Sunday Book Review with the headline, "Love is all you need, or is it?"